Welcome everyone to today's Edison Electric Institute webinar on brand storytelling, building authentic stakeholder relationships in turbulent times. My name is Vanessa Ferrero, and I am an analyst for international programs at EEI. Today's webinar will be a conversation between branding expert Dr. Fridrik Larsen and EEI Vice President for International Programs, Lawrence Jones. Throughout this session, we encourage you to join in the conversation by submitting questions or comments using the chat feature. And now I'll turn this over to Lawrence, who will provide his opening remarks.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you again, Dr. Larsen, Fridrik, if I may call you that, for joining us for this very interesting and stimulating conversation around branding. As we all know, the world is undergoing what I would call turbulent times as it relates to some of the events that are occurring. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is really disrupting almost all sectors in the world. And obviously, what is important, we know that in these times, nothing is more important than being able to communicate with your stakeholders, but also to develop the proper relationships with your stakeholders. And history has shown us that successful brands are the ones who have the opportunity to tell good stories that will not just delight and inspire and challenge their audience, but also motivate them. And so we're very delighted this afternoon to have a conversation with Dr. Larsen to talk about some of the challenges he sees, or some of the ways he sees COVID-19 pandemic affecting this issue of branding and storytelling, and how companies should manage their tonality to make sure that the stories they are telling really reflect and address the needs of their multiple stakeholders. And so we're going to dig a little deeper into some of these topics today, with a focus obviously on the electricity sector. As we have seen, this pandemic has shown us that electricity is undoubtedly one of the indispensable, perhaps the most indispensable commodity in the world when it comes to making sure we have a sound and functioning modern society. And so before I turn it over to Fridrik to give some opening remarks, we're going to keep this very conversational style webinar here today. And so just a brief introduction. Dr. Larsen is renowned expert on branding and based in Iceland. And so I'm sure he will share a few thoughts when it comes to the situation in Iceland. But he wrote a book, Energy Branding, which it's a bestseller. And I met Dr. Larsen about a year and a half ago. And I must tell you that what he has done in his career to try and put a focus and a spotlight on branding, I think is extremely important. He's also a professor, lecturer at the university in Reykjavik. And his work not only focuses on branding, he's also an entrepreneur in that he launched a company that focuses on branding and really branding energy with a focus on the energy sector more broadly. So, Fridrik, I think I'll hand it over to you to say some opening remarks, and then we can jump straight into the conversation. Over to you.
Thanks. Well, it's a pleasure, of course, to be here, and thanks for inviting me. Can you see me properly? I see the slide. Is it okay? There you are. Okay. No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's an honor because, well, I'll just give you a short background. It's an honor to be talking with the EEI because I started this journey, if you will, in 2007. I was thinking about what should I write my PhD about? I have backgrounds in psychology and finance, very different degrees. And I was thinking, okay, now I have to move on. I want to write my PhD. What should I write about? Should I do it for the PhD? Should I do it for finance? I didn't want to do either of those. So I said, I'll combine them into the same subject, which is branding. Why? Because branding is the psychology of the masses, how you talk to people, how you understand groups of people, and you have to make money doing it. And when I started to work in the States after I graduated, the very first question I always got, what's the ROI of your services? So it's the best question in the world, basically. It's not about doing something nice or cosmetic. It's about making money, of course. That being said, I started 2007, and I said, okay, I'll write about something that's, it's like branding, I said, but I want to do it on something that's relevant to the world, if you will. And I saw how the telecom markets had been changing. They have been moving from, monopolistic markets where the people have actually had a choice. So they had the power, if you will. This is 2007 again, and the energy markets, of course, had been moving down the route of liberalization. They are still moving down that route, and I wanted to say, okay, I'm gonna study energy. I want to understand how an energy company talks to a consumer, and that's across the value chain. Whether it's a end consumer, B2B consumer, or someone in a different place in the value chain. But most branding is mostly associated with a retail consumer. And the biggest misconception is that branding is not for B2B. That's wrong. It's just simply wrong. So you need that also there. So I wrote the book. Sorry, I did the PhD. I finished it, and I did talks all over. I published the book 2017. It's largely based on my PhD and my findings. And what I set out to understand is, which button do you press for the consumer, for him to understand you? What do you do differently? Because you cannot really apply normal branding theories or normal marketing principles onto a market that's so different. For some, energy is like the air you breathe, and you don't want to be talked to like you're buying a soda drink or Coca-Cola or something. So you have to think about those differences. And I wrote the book, and it was successful, and at least it's been sold a lot, and I'm really happy about it. Mm-hmm. And since 2007, people didn't really understand what I was talking about. So, and that's why, I come in the full circle saying I'm honored to be talking to the EEI, because I bet you that, 13 years ago, I wouldn't be on this, I wouldn't be on this webinar, because there was something else be going on. Yes. And why would anyone be choosing soft sciences like branding when you're in the business of connecting lines, power lines? So there's a lot of that issue going on. It's interesting. So, but branding, at the end of the day, is about telling stories, and this is about telling stories through turbulent times. And the oldest form of communication is telling stories by the fire. Think about primal people back in 1,000 years ago, yes. Telling stories, and a good brand needs to tell a story. But I find within the energy space and the energy companies, sometimes they are afraid of telling the story. They are more thinking about just not sticking the neck out and not being noticed, instead of actually putting the chest out, tell the story, because oftentimes they have a good story. Yes. So in a lot of places in the world, people just don't like the energy companies. It's largely their own fault because they are not communicating. Brands are about communication and telling a story. So, and it's interesting, and it's changing very fast. And since the book came out 2017, it's 3 years, I'm working with a huge energy company, Fortune 100 energy company. I have talks with them in helping them to understand the client. And the guy I'm actually talking to, he is a nuclear scientist. So he understands nuclear power plants. But now he's been tasked with understanding people. So it's a fascinating narrative, because people are actually moving to social sciences. They're saying, okay, there is maybe something there for us. Maybe we shouldn't just only thinking about engineering. Let's think about social sciences. So that's the basic background. But maybe something that I can ask you to start with, Lawrence. I know you're the guy asking the questions. I know that, but I'm sitting up here in Iceland, and Iceland is in terms of COVID, we are not over it in economic sense, but we are over it in terms of health aspects. There is nobody in the emergency room. There's maybe 7 people affected. Things are back to normal. We go to our shops, and we go to the swimming pools, and we do all that stuff we used to. So people are really relieved. So, hang in there, you'll be there too. But what's worrying me, of course, is what's happening in America right now. More turbulent times. So, and the EEI issued a statement yesterday, I think it was. So, why is it important for EEI to issue such a strong statement? And how do you dare to be a part of political arena, if you will?
Well, I think, one of the things that EEI has over the years really prioritized the issue of diversity and inclusion. One of the things we recognize is the importance of making sure that our workforce is diverse. One of the things that we see more and more now is that within the industry, by and large, the issue of diversity and inclusion is being prioritized across the industry. One of the things that was very pleasing is that it didn't take long to get our public statement out, which is a clear indication that this is something that EEI takes very seriously. Our members take it very seriously. And so if you read the statement by our president, Tom Kuhn, I mean, he made it very clear that, racial intolerance is something that EI will not stand for. The issue here of really being committed to diversity and inclusion is centered to what is happening within the industry. What I found very interesting, Frederick, was that when the statement was issued, we have gotten a lot of feedback from CEOs outside of the US as well. And so whilst this is a current crisis being dealt with in the US in terms of the challenges we're facing, I think the resounding feedback from even CEOs of other electric companies outside of the US have been very positive and have also been very supportive. So I think by and large, this is certainly a moment in time where you mentioned the issue of branding. From an EI perspective, it's important that we do not sit on the sidelines and not have our voice heard. And so I think that's why you saw such a strong statement coming from our CEO on behalf of the industry.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I respect that, but if I'll take this, what's going on now, and put it into a pure branding perspective. And before I do this, branding for some is just, in some industries, branding is just within energy. I find if I say branding, people get offended because they don't want to be a brand person, but they want to understand communications. So I think this is a really a sign of health for the energy space to do this, because they are actually taking a stand. They are daring to have an option and say it out aloud. They are taking sides, and it's not an option to stay silent. But if I'll take this on a different level to brands, the same thing applies on a micro level for brands. If they don't take a position, if they don't dare to say what they think, if they are not genuine, if they are not authentic, they will not become good brands. If they will not become good brands, they will be taken over by other brands, which are probably coming from the outside of the energy space. And those companies that will take over, of course, I don't know that. I can't tell the future, but I do know that, it's too common in the energy space that the knowledge of the consumer is overlooked. So they don't have the inside knowledge of how to behave, and they'll be taken over by the Googles and the Amazons of the world, basically, when the technology is going to move things around.
Well, thank you for the question. I wasn't anticipating being the one receiving the questions, but I really appreciate. I think the question you raised, Frederick, is an important one. I'm glad you asked, and I think it was important for me to make it clear that the EEI's position on this is very, very clear, as was indicated in that press statement that was issued by our president, Tom Kuhn. So thanks again for the question. Let's get into the book, and let's get into this conversation around branding. And the theme here obviously is for building authentic relationship with your stakeholders. So you've already talked a little bit what branding is and what branding isn't, but given the fact that our industry is a very interesting one in terms of being both regulated in some cases, you have non-regulated, you have competitive aspects, you have non-competitive aspects. As you know, EEI has over, including our US members, we probably have about 150 electric companies around the world. So you have all kinds of ownership structures, regulatory structures, policy structures. Why is it necessary, irrespective of whether you are a competitive market or non-competitive, regulated or non-regulated, why is branding so important, especially now during this period of the world where you have this pandemic and where you have customers going through all kinds of challenges? Why is branding so important? How do you think about it from the standpoint of telling the story to multiple stakeholders?
I think I can answer this in just one word, basically. And that word is trust. A brand, it helps your stakeholders, whether they, the government, they are the whomever it is in the value chain. So it's about trust, basically.
Mhm.
But that's the one word explanation. But let me give you a longer version though. To many, branding is about selling something. It's about having a picture of something. And on purpose, I put this as a backdrop here. And just in case you don't see it, I'll move it here. This is branding.
Yes.
So you can see me there. This is branding.
Mhm.
Branding, and I'm just gonna look for advertising. This is advertising. This small piece of the cake. But to many, this is branding. That's it. So why branding? It's about how you organize your world, if you will. It's about how you talk to people. It's about why you say the things that you do. It's about trying to understand them and talk to people on their terms. It's about how you communicate. It's your promise, basically. And in the energy space, because I work for many companies, very high-level CEOs in the European utilities, they say branding is a promise. It's a promise of of how you do things and who you are. And in turbulent times like it is at the moment, it's really important if you can actually bundle what you are into a concept that's known, academically tested, a brand, basically. So that's why it's important. But of course, I could talk a long time why it's important. But another thing too is without turbulent times or not, it's also important because it's not about just your clients. It's important for your clients. It's also about the people who work for you, people within the organization. There's a talent war going on, if you will, and you will be in a much better position to attract young, bright people who want to make their career within energy. So instead of going to, again, to the Googles or, Silicon Valley or something like that. So two aspects, internal, external. Both of those are really important, in terms of, why you want to be a brand. But I find you just cut me off if I think if my answers are too long.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, but what I find fascinating is how everybody is basically the same. Every time I start to work for a particular company, I run into the same issue, and that's the alignment between identity and image. Meaning, the energy companies, if they think they are something, but their clients, their customers think they're something totally different. And if you have this mismatch, you will not be able to communicate efficiently, directly, because you think that you're something, people that your clients think you're something else, and you talk to them the way you think they will listen, but they won't. So the first part of a good rebranding, if you will, or branding exercise, brand audit, is just to work inside the company and understand the culture, understand the DNA, understand the stories, understand the narrative, what it can be saying in a meaningful way to their audience, to their clients, out to the community, if you will.
So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned two words. You mentioned trust, and I think that's a very important thing. And you mentioned promise, right? So I want to tie trust and promise to something you talk about in the book, so very clear, is about the issue of a perception. And you just mentioned the idea of the promise, and you mentioned trust. But how does one, in these times, how does one deal with the issue of perception, and how does one manage their brand through a filter of making sure that the perception, which is if there's a gap between reality versus perception, you have an issue. So how does one go about as an energy company or electric company talking about reducing this gap between perception and reality in terms of what they promise and what they deliver?
That's a good question. I think the first thing to understand is that reality doesn't matter, perception matter. This is a philosophical question, obviously.
Yes.
So what perception is everything. What I think is my reality, but traditionally within energy, it's such a strong tendency to be the one in control and not thinking about the customer. So I think the best thing that companies should be doing, you cannot decide to become a brand during turbulent times. You did that way a long time ago. And if you want to go through a recession, you start becoming a good brand now and go through the next one, if you will, because you can't do much brand building in months. It takes years, basically. So it always comes back to the same thing. Understand your client base, understand your stakeholders, and understand how you talk to them so they have the right perception of you. And you have to do this authentically. Yeah. You have to be genuine. These are the same words. I'm going to be saying them over and over again, because that is actually the key. You cannot put lipstick on a pig. You cannot be something that you're not. You have to understand yourself first before you start to, before you can begin even to, manipulate your perception, if you will.
So in the book, you also talk about, which I found very fascinating, you talk about sort of, I guess, the challenge facing an industry that has a commodity that is not easy to differentiate. So you use several ways of branding. You talk about the issue around differentiation. You talk about price. You talk about service. So let's first talk about the challenge facing the issue of electricity. You did an excellent job, and I was nice to read it, because I believe this myself. For many electric companies, electric customers, the value of electricity is when the lights are on or off, right? And so you talk about the challenge of differentiation. Talk a little bit about how you see that happening in an industry where the value we're offering is highest when the commodity is gone in some cases. And now everyone is saying electricity is the most indispensable commodity in the world because it was important to keep the lights on. How does that inability to differentiate still have to be giving you an opportunity to brand yourself? Because you can't differentiate on product, you have to differentiate on something else. Can you talk about that differentiation and product and service situation that face our industry?
It's a big question, but I'll start by saying something else though, because I'm really glad that you liked the book, because maybe just for those who are listening, I want to tell a short story of how I got to know you. I got to know you actually at Charles, my own event where we talk about energy brands and how you communicate.
Yes.
And you were a speaker on the panel, did excellently. And then that panel was over, and the next one came on, and then you were really vocal in the audience, asking questions about why should it be a brand? Why should it be like this? So, and it really sparked a fantastic conversation if there was a non-believer in the audience, which I took you for. Yeah. And then I learned that you're not so, you are smart after all. Joke, of course. Yeah. No, and he did. So I'm really glad that you liked the book. And but to your question, how do you differentiate a commodity? When I started my PhD, I did it in Aston Business School in the UK, and that's #1 university in terms of research activity on a PhD level. So in marketing. So, and I got accepted, and then I've told them broadly what I was going to be writing about, and then I got accepted, and I said, okay, now let's start to write about how you brand a commodity, electricity in this case. But then things got a little bit more difficult than I anticipated, because they said, and this is 2007, mind you, well, Fridrik, you cannot brand a commodity. You have to write about something else, because it's impossible. Because the only thing you can differentiate a commodity is a price.
Yes.
And by definition, that's correct. But this is only 13 years ago. It's not a long time ago. But I said, okay, this is unfortunate, but I came here to write about this, and I'll just have to go somewhere else if I can't do it. So I persevered, I wrote about it, and you can. So the first thing is you have to believe that you can brand a commodity. Believe. I'm using a word like believe in a business sense. It doesn't really have a place, but you have to believe it. And you have to believe it because there's a lot of literature out there that actually shows you that it can, if you apply basic branding principles on a commodity, and I'm talking about electricity, but this applies to other commodities as well, aluminum or flour or whatever. So you have to believe that. A banana even, I mean, banana has brands and you choose banana, they're still all of the same. And water, you're drinking water right now, that's a pure commodity, but you can have a price difference of 10-fold, 20-fold if the right brand is on there. So you have to believe it. And but in case of electricity, it's a tricky thing. It's so close to global warming. It's so close to like cutting close to our resources. It's so close to being like the air you breathe. And it's so close to be just a part of human life. So when you have a commodity like this, it is really hard. Well, it's harder to actually brand it because you don't have all the room to play with. The easiest thing in the world to brand, according to research, is cars. because you can work with the smell when you buy, with the tires, with the engine. You can just a ton of things that you can actually play with to get the right emotions, from your buyers. You can't do this with energy. You just cannot. And it's always the same. You always get the same electrons. You can, of course, brand the origin, green or non-green or nuclear or whatever. So, but you have to brand something else. But as we have learned in the past 10 years, you really, if you apply the right principles, you can brand electricity just like anything else. And again, if you're a good brand going through, the recession turbulent times that we're having right now, people do feel better about doing business with you. And if you think about huge companies like British Gas or those big six in the UK, for example, their benefit is to have sleepers. And sleeper is a person that just doesn't mind really about the energy. They just pay the bill, and you can actually go onto a site. You go to the price comparison site, and you can choose the lowest one, and you can save up to half on a yearly basis. But still, only about 30% of the people do it, because because they are happy with the brand. If it was only about price, everybody would be changing constantly, but they're not. So it's not about price.
Yeah. So in the context of service, because you also talk about service branding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that because of the structure of the industry, in some countries where there is not a retail competition, you have a vertical integration of the utility sector still. It's still important that they also work on their brand at the end of the day, right? So can you talk a little bit about service branding and why electricity being delivered, that electricity customers continue to, not customers, but companies focus on this issue of service branding? What are some of the things you see coming out of this pandemic when it comes to service branding? How do you brand the services you're offering your customers in the middle of a pandemic, and how do you tell that story about the services you're offering your customers in the middle of a pandemic?
You ask challenging questions, good questions. So how do you brand the service? Well, again, to what I was saying, that you can't really do much with the product. So what can you do? You can provide a good service, and you can brand the service. But I'm just gonna do a curveball here. I suppose that's American saying. I'm not gonna answer the question directly.
Sure.
Because we talk about points of parity and points of difference. Mm-hmm. Points of parity is what you do well enough because everybody else in the industry, they'll do it. And points of difference is being different somehow. And a service really should be a point of parity. It just should be good enough. Because if you can actually brand your service, that means that your competition is really not doing a good job at all, because you just should do perfect service and then find your branding angle somewhere else. Find it in some other stuff. Find some emotional angles, some dimensions which are actually not in the product. And in the good brands, because Charles, the conference that where I met you, we award the world's best energy brands, and there's a big panel of experts that are they choose them. We talk to them. They have to send a survey to their clients, and they have to turn in a case. So it's a very rigorous process for them to go through.
Yes.
To my mind, I can't think of anyone in the past 5 years or 4 years that just won because they provided a good service. They had a good service, leave that there, and they did something else. You just provide a good service, just do it, and then do something else. I hope I'm answering your question in a sneaky way, but I hope please feel to follow up. Yeah.
No. I think you make a valid point, because one of the things we've seen through this pandemic is that electric companies across the world, including in Iceland, have done a good job in keeping the lights on, right? And so that service that was offered certainly is tied to the brand. But what I'm hearing you say is that besides the service which you should offer anyway, you should then think about other ways to sort of strengthen your brand, especially during these times. And that brings me to the question of attributes, right? And so as I was thinking, in the book, you talk about green. You talk about green, green electricity. And it's been around for a while, right? But of late, what we now have are other attributes that are coming around the energy or the electricity sector, right? So you have now things like sustainability, right? You have, in addition to that, you have resilience. You have also the issue of environmental sustainability governance, ESG. So you have these new attributes. Is that where you see a lot of companies now, electricity companies, trying to create an additional stronger brand by focusing on some of those attributes? And if that's the case, what stories should they be telling if they're going to focus on some of those new attributes like resilience, like sustainability? What sort of thoughts would you have around that idea of looking at these new attributes of the commodity or of the sector, if you may?
Yeah, good point, good question. First thing to understand is, first thing to realize is where your customer is. This is the same thing all over. So it's just STP of marketing, which is the segmentation, targeting, positioning. So segment, target, position. So it's the same thing. You have to segment your clients, understand where they are. So in terms of if you want to push the green agenda with them, if you want to become a green brand, sustainable brand, then you have to understand how much do they understand of this green thing. Let's just talk about green for now. And the short answer is they don't understand it. And to a large extent, they don't care about it. Of course, we have movements, we have Greta Thunberg, and we have things moving along. But to date, people are not, well, of course, on a normal curve, you'll find people that are extremely, non-environmental and very environmental. And on the environmental angle, you'll have people that will pay for it. These are the people who you drove Priuses 20 years ago, with knitted suits, just that kind of people.
Yep.
Not just to draw, to paint with a broad brush. They will care and they'll pay more, but they are just not big enough to focus on it for a big company.
Yes.
So that's why you have to offer products. You have to have a product for these kind of people that want that. But the average client, they don't care, they don't understand. And on my academic side, then I did research here in Europe to try to understand what is green electricity to the client. And they confused it with a lot of different things. They confused it with corporate social responsibility. They confused it with ethics. They confused it with politics. They confused it with different kinds of renewables. So when you say green, you might as well be saying love or hate or using some big words which have 100 meanings for 100 people. So you have to first understand where your client base is located in terms of how you want to talk to them. So understand them first. Understanding. And that's, of course, when we work with our clients, we have a special tool that measures positioning. You run the tool, then you can understand, then you can begin to understand what you should say. Because in some cases, if you want to, again, you want to be a green company, it's impossible for you if your customers, first of all, don't care about it, or if they don't trust you. Again, that word trust. They will not trust anything that comes out of your mouth if you haven't built a trust level first.
And I think, so you brought one point to my mind as you talk about the issue of how you communicate with them, that's language. And I should say, so a couple of years ago, I think it was 2016, EI, recognizing the importance, actually did a project called the Lexicon Project. And in that project, we kind of looked at different ways and different words in terms of how you communicate with customers. And one of the very interesting findings was that for many, and we still see it today, that many people still refer to electricity customers, or they were referred to as ratepayers. That has changed because now they're no longer referred to as ratepayers. They are actually referred to as, their customers. They're treated differently. So that perception of how you viewed your customers changed and how they view themselves changed. So let's stay on the point of how you engage your customers. One other topic I think is very fascinating here is in terms of engaging with multiple stakeholders, right? Because now, as we look at the pandemic and other crises, you're, as a company, you're speaking to multiple listeners, multiple stakeholders. Is your thought here that in that the company should have one message for each audience, or multiple messages, or one common message for everybody, and then depending on who you're talking to when? That seems to be a very difficult challenge to come up with so many different messages. How should one go about sort of segmenting, as you said, your customer or your stakeholders in this case, and then targeting the message for different groups without having overlap in the messages, right? Because you don't want to contradict yourself. So how does one go about doing that? And what are your research showing you in terms of what some companies are doing?
No, it's a great question, Lawrence. One size does not fit all, for sure. We know that, although we think it's easier for us to think about it that way. And before I answer, how you talk about your branding strategy, I want to pick up your point about ratepayers, because this is still ongoing. And here in Europe also, you have end loads, you have meters, you have all kind of technical terms for people of flesh and blood. People that make decisions on their, because they love and hate. That those two words, not because they are only rational, they're also emotional. And I was working for an Eastern European company that was just in a market that's been liberalized, huge company, but they didn't have customers. Well, this sounds off. They thought, to their mind, they just didn't have customers. They were just making energy and selling it to someone. So you have to change that mindset first within the company before that's your journey. It's in the energy space. Your journey is internally. It's no problem to go to ad agency and do something nice. It's just not a problem. But you have to do it internally. So to your point about different products, that's a really good question. And let's think about Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, the real thing. The original thing since 18 something. That's Coca-Cola. But do they only sell Coca-Cola? No, they don't. They have Coke Zero. They have they have a variety of products covering their different segments. Okay. And if they don't want cola drink, they'll go to Sprite or they go to Fanta, because they understand that there are different people buying different drinks. Should it be like this for energy? Yes and no. It should not be that complex, because the energy consumer is the same person. That's the same person that buys Coca-Cola or Fanta. It's the very same person, but they don't read that much into that commodity. Yes. So you can have your offering much easier, but you should talk differently to different groups, but have the frame very set. Let's say 80% the same, 90% the same, and then you vary your message according to me talking to, and you're also talking to regulators, you're talking to governments, you're talking to organizations, you're talking to environmental agencies, and that should be the same messages. If you think about it, a person that says one thing to you, Lawrence, and I turn around and say something else to another one, I just say something different, I'm crazy. Mm-hmm. I'm not trustworthy. I'm not credible. So you have to have the same message. The trick, branding is really boring when you come down to it. It's not about nice designs or logos or colors. It's about being consistent year after year after year after year and say the same thing. Did I answer your question?
You did. So you bring up, and every time you answer my question, you bring a new question that kind of takes me off my script of questions here, but that's good. You talk about consistency, right? Mm-hmm. And in the time of turbulence in which COVID-19, for example, a lot of disruptions going on, and you need to be consistent. But let's also talk about another aspect, and it's that the tonality or tone deafness, right? How does one, with empathy, tell their stories about what's happening in their industry in a way that is not tone deaf? Because I think that's one of the concerns a lot of entities will have. When I was first trying to put together this webinar, this conversation, I talked to a few people and said, oh, Lawrence, this is not the time to talk about branding because, you have to be sensitive to the customers. And that is very important, right? People are going through difficult times. So how does one balance the issue of empathy with the tonality of how you tell your story? Because you have to still be talking, like you said. You can't be silent, right, in the middle of a crisis. So how does one deal with the issue of tone deafness? How do you avoid? What should you be thinking about when you start looking at the tone with which you tell your story?
Well, I think maybe Churchill said, "Never waste a good crisis." So that's a famous saying. So never waste a good crisis. So let's think about commercial part of the whole thing. It's about making money, as we started off. It's about making money. It's about maximizing wealth to stakeholders, to shareholders. Sorry, that's what it's all about at the end of the day. And you might have a double bottom line or triple bottom line and all that, but you have to make money at the end of the day. So should you use the recession to gain more trust from your customers? The bad answer is yes, you should. But if you went there in the beginning, if you went that brand that was allowed to be genuine, that it was allowed to show empathy, then it might be hard for you. But I'll give credit to the manager of the energy companies. No, when I will say the following: during the crisis, many of them have shown their human face. And why do I say human? Again, I'm gonna go back to the awards. Last year, 2019, on stage, I called up on stage all those who won. This was an impromptu thing. I didn't tell them any questions. And there were people in the audience. I asked them, why do you deserve to be the world's best brand in your category? It's again, sneaky. It's a sneaky question. It's not a fair question maybe, but these are smart people. They just won. So let's be a little bit, let's talk about this. One thing came out of it, which every one of them said, which we are human. We are a human brand. So again, on the turbulent times and COVID, many of the energy companies have actually dared to be human, employing a psychologist on the staff to understand people, and employing, people from the health industries to, deal with their clients. So understanding and really be genuine in doing it. And that's just a fantastic way of staying in business, doing good for society and make money. I mean, just being a kind-hearted company that cares. If that's not the energy company, then who is? I mean, if not energy. But then again, everybody can't jump on that bandwagon, if you will. Some of them are just not positioning them in that way. For example, there's a company in the UK called Brewdog, I think. Brewdog, and they are a brand of fun, and they do interesting things all the time. And the guy who was advising Boris Johnson, he went to a place called, I forget the place, it starts with a C. So during the crisis, he went to a place where he shouldn't have gone, because he should have stayed home. He shouldn't have gone to visit his family. Maybe you know this. So they came out with a beer just now that bears the name of this place, actually. So they are using the recession to play with words and being fun. An energy company could not do this.
No.
So there are limits to this. But again, to answer your question, it's hard for you to gain trust. Well, if you didn't have this element beforehand, you would only gain a little bit. If you're already on the human route and you were a route of understanding, being genuine, then you will gain a lot during the recession, basically. And that's brand equity. That's the word brand equity, basically. It means that if you're known for something, you will gain more the more you do of it.
Interesting. So that brings me to the topic of psychology, which is something you major in or you studied. And one of the things I have noticed, is that there's a lot of psychology used in terms of how things are defined. So, for example, you have the green economy. Now you have the blue economy when you talk about the ocean. And what fascinates me is that these terms, like you've just said, they are oftentimes simple, but when you start to peel it, it's very complex, like the green economy. What's it actually mean, right? So now the world is going through this new phase in the industry called the energy transition. Now, how does such a concept, energy transition, in the midst of a pandemic, if you're supposed to tell the story of everything you're doing in support of the energy transition, whereas at the same time your stakeholders are having to deal with the pandemic, how do you do both? How does one balance out the idea that both are important, the green economy, energy transition, it's important, but in the same vein, you have the impact of the health crisis as a result of the COVID pandemic. So right there, you're going to have to balance those two messages that kind of link to your brand. How does one do that?
I hadn't really thought about anything on those terms.
Well, you give me the idea when you mentioned psychology, because I think it's a psychology of how you tell that story.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But the boring as I am, I mean, being consistent in what I'm saying, you should have designed your brand beforehand. That's the strategic part of branding. And Philip Kotler is the iconic person of marketing. And he said, marketing is the art of science and art. The artistic part is the creativity that comes to advertising. The scientific part is the strategy part. And in the strategy phase, you design your brand. You're the architect, that someone else will build your house. You design it beforehand, or you're the skipper of a oil tanker, and you want to go from America to Europe. You'll just start and you end there. There might be you might catch bad weather, but you'll take your course and you end up in Europe or in America when you go back. Same with brands. Although something happens, which is as terrible as COVID, you don't just change because of it. Your general message is to go through it, but then you adapt. And then you adapt to what's going on. And then you of course, you show a different face. But if you were already on the sustainable, route, if you will, if you're in that, doing that, you don't stop it because of COVID. But then on a more high level answer, look at what the world could do in terms of COVID. Look at how they could respond. Look at how they could fight a common enemy, which we could see. I mean, why can't we fight, global warming in the same way? It's an enemy you don't see. It's like high blood pressure. It's silent killer. It just kills you, but we cannot tackle it because we can't understand it and we can't see it. You understand COVID, so we fight it together.
So is the issue it's the issue of adapting your brand, which I really like, right? Yeah. Adapting your brand to make sure it's in line with that. So we got a couple of more minutes left. Let's try to get into some other topics here. So one of the things I want to talk about, Fridrik, is the issue of the perception, coming back to perception and reality, right? But maybe a little macro, moving from the electricity industry to some extent, but just talking more or less along the lines of energy poverty across the world. And in many parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the big issue in many countries is the perception of risk, so that they cannot attract investments, right? And I think the industry is about to go through that even outside of Africa, with the perception of risk. And you see, is it risky to invest now in the industry? Maybe I should wait after COVID. I shouldn't wait. So how would you view branding in the context of a national, I said, like a country, trying to talk about a risk, the reality of risk and the perception of risk? How does that impact your brand in terms of attracting people to come and invest in your country? How do you tell the story? Or you could even use Iceland, for example, right? How do you tell the story about it's not risky to invest in Iceland because of these reasons? How should, say, African governments, for example, tell the story that close the gap between perceived risk and real risk?
Interesting. Well, because you mentioned both Africa and you mentioned Iceland.
Yes.
Iceland, we are lucky. We are 99% renewable. So it's just all our houses are warmed with geothermal energy. We have the rest of the energy is made from hydro, and we just clean. So we are lucky. We don't have to think much about it, and we don't think enough about it because we are so lucky. And so, and we have a relatively stable economic situation and okay government and all that stuff. But if you're an investor, you really are only doing a very simple SWOT analysis. You're doing strength, opportunities, threats, and opportunities, threats, strength, and weaknesses. And when you apply this to an economy that it has a perceived risk, you'll stop very fast, because okay, this is risky, let's go to a less risk. And you'll just move away from it really fast. It's really hard for a country that is already struggling with political issues, economic issues, all that stuff. They can't do much to compensate, basically. Of course, we moved out of branding for sure, yeah. But in terms of let's again focus on Iceland, because I know that part. My position, I think Iceland should focus totally day in, day out on energy, clean energy, not just the electrons, but also energy of the people, energy of the waters, energy of the nature. Everything we should do should be around energy, sustainability, green. And that will attract investors because they want to have that associated with the product. If you're Switzerland, you'll benefit. If you're manufacturing watches and you're from Switzerland, you say Switzerland. Iceland, if you're selling something that requires cleanness, Iceland. But when you go to the less developed countries, like in some African countries, what can you do in terms of branding? Then you have to be a little bit, not creative, but find what it is that you can actually say. Tell the stories you can actually find. Dig to understand what it is that doesn't meet the eye. Some stories that you can bring forth that helps your narrative when you want to attract investors. Mm-hmm. So but that's same thing basically. When you work for a company, you work for a country, you work for a government. You just have to understand, you dig, understand where your DNA, how it is, look at it, understand it, and then bring it forth, talk about it, and help people to understand it.
And you never know. And I think in the context of what you just said, underlying all of that, it goes back to where you started talking about, which is trust, right? So you have to have trust in this equation. Yeah. And I think when we look at the energy transition, wherever you are as a company, along the electricity value chain, you have to be consistent in your message and commitment to the energy transition, and also build that trust around your constituencies to make that work. I want to come to some non-technical, non-branding related questions. It's somewhat related to branding, but I want to talk a little about Iceland. Mm-hmm. Can you, just for the audience, not many people have been to Iceland, I would assume, mm-hmm. right, compared to other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So what is life like in Iceland today as a result of COVID? I mean, what are some of the things you're seeing that's happening there that maybe that will tell you the strength of the brand of Iceland as a country, as a tourist nation? What's happening in Iceland today as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I think, in terms of, well, I don't want to talk about the political situation and your president, but that's what's going on in the States is very different from what's going on here in Iceland and Europe. The people are just humble in understanding there's a problem, we'll tackle it together and we'll do our best, that we don't know what's going on, we will not blame anyone, we will just tackle this together. And from the very beginning, that's what it was done here. The experts were allowed to be experts, and they were, and there was a panel of 3 people that came on television every day, and they were almost like, it's like a soap opera. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they came on and everybody liked them, and and you did tests online, which of these 3 are you, and all that stuff. So, but the nation was just trusted to behave responsibly, and we did. There was no, we could leave the houses and we could do basically what we wanted as long as we behaved responsibly. There couldn't be more than 50 of us in a room. We had to stay 2 meters apart, and this has worked for us, but we are small. There's only 300,000 people in a really big country. So there's one Icelandic person to every 1,000 Americans. And there are no subways here, and there are no really crowded places. So it's easier for us, of course. Mm-hmm. But we are now at the moment where we feel free basically, because we don't have. I can hug my friend when I see him, and I don't have to be so scared. But we still are. We wash our hands and do everything we need to do. So we behave responsibly. And I told about geothermal. Let's tie this to energy a little bit. One of our favorite pastimes is going to the swimming pools. So the public swimming pools, and they are warm also in the winter. Mm-hmm. So a week ago, they opened the swimming pools again, and they opened at midnight, and there was a long line of people at midnight and through the whole night just going through the pool, because that's what they missed the most. So they missed the energy, basically. Missed geothermal, if you will, going to the swimming pools.
Yeah. Well, so I want to go back then, since you brought us back to energy. I want to go into the future a little bit, and this is a question that I have just thought about, and you probably haven't given it much thought, but you're a brilliant man. I'm sure you will figure out an answer to my question, no matter how complex it is. It has to do with the temporal nature of brand, and that by that I mean, so we're in the year 2010, I mean 2020, and I'm kind of like trying to take us to the year 2030. The reason because most energy infrastructure, they are long-lived assets, right? And so that means you want to hold on to your customer and hold on to the service you're offering for a long time to be able to recover the investments you're making, right? How does one manage the brand journey? And I haven't heard this phrase before, so maybe it's the first time I've come up with something strange. The branding of the journey of your brand. How does one manage that brand, the journey, and combine that with the customer journey? Because those are two journeys, right? You have the customer journey and you have the branding of the journey of your brand. Because you said, Fridrik, that your brand has to adapt, right? As much as you can. So as you're adapting your brand to COVID in responding with stories, when we come out of COVID and go into the next normal, whatever that next normal is, how does one go about dealing with that? Because times are constantly changing. So try to put us 10 years from now. You're an energy company. You've developed a brand that should be there and have brand equity. How do you preserve that equity over time? What are you supposed to be thinking about? What are you supposed to do? And answer, if you may, one last point to the question, by also taking into consideration the fact that you have multiple stakeholders. Demographics shift. So the older generation, the younger generation, I know it's a complex question, but can you talk about the temporal nature of brand and the journey of a brand over time, given all the changes that are occurring in society?
You were correct. This is a complex question. So, but let me just try to answer it though.
Sure.
Good question. I think we should start internally again. So there will be no brand journey if there's not acceptance in the highest places within the company. There's no brand journey at all, because nothing will happen. Things will remain the same, basically. And if there's not money allocated to it, and if there's not understanding from the CEO and he's a part of it, no journey. And also, so the hardest part is to sell this internally, and also a brand journey, from coming a product to a brand. So this is not the same thing. A brand and a product. A product is a product, but a brand is something with added on top of that product, some elements of something, rationality, emotionality. So you have to so when you're doing this journey, and let's say we are here in COVID, in these turbulent times, now we understand it's okay for us to be honest. It's okay for us to be open. We want to be that kind of brand in the future. Becoming that, designing that brand and communicating that brand, paying money to ads and telling about it, that's all going to be written off within the year. So the cost of becoming a brand, I'll make less money in this year. I'll make less money in 2021 and 2023, because in 2024, 25, 26, 2030, then I'm starting to reap the benefits. So the hard part is to get the organization to understand you will invest now. It's not expenses. You invest now to be able to be a part of the future, basically. So you will actually be one of the ones selling energy in the future. Because if you don't go on that brand journey, you'll be a commodity provider. Someone else, an intermediary, will come between us. He'll understand the clients and he'll take your business. He'll do the margins. So I might be off on a tangent answering your question, but the journey needs to be understood internally. It needs to be understood that it takes time, it costs money, but it will secure you a place in an uncertain future. Becoming a brand is your cheapest insurance policy ever, because you're investing in a consumer's mind.
Good. So to wrap things up, because I think we're on the hour now, the last question here, perfect segue, is the long view, because that's what you talk about. So you need to take the long-term perspective when you're developing your brand. As a final question, though, can you just reflect a little bit on the changes in the expectations of your customers, the value systems, the value in society. How should your brand adapt to those changes? Because we know, for example, COVID has brought a whole new set of value value elements to society, right? So talk just briefly, and we'll wrap things up. How does your brand evolve as the social norms in society change, and how should you adapt to that?
You mean an energy brand, or just in general a brand?
Well, just about electricity branding specifically, because
right.
it's service oriented. So you talk a little bit about that specifically. Yes.
The thing is, we don't really know the new normal. We don't know whether we go back to the old normal or not.
Okay.
But what we do know, that us as people will not change very much. We have our emotions, and we love our children, and we love our families, and we like Pepsi Cola or we don't, or I like to drive Tesla or I don't. So we will be the same on the insides of us. So that hasn't changed for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. The environment has changed. Our expectations have changed. A lot of what we consume has changed, but we are still human beings. So what I'm saying is nothing much has changed. So if you'll just take at face value what a human being is, an identity of a sort, and if you cluster enough human beings of the same kind together, you have a segment. And you'll talk to them in a similar way. So just the final key is just understand your customer, and then you'll be a part of their future, basically. I know I'm giving you, an academic answer to your good question, but that's just still things will have a tendency not to change very much. We are now flying and we are driving cars, but not riding horse wagons. But a lot of things just remain the same a lot. Now, young people will be young people, old people will be old people. So just understand that and how that works.
Yes. Well, listen, Fridrik, I really thank you for taking the time from your late afternoon in Reykjavik to spend with us here and our audience to talk about this issue of branding in these turbulent times in which we live. But I think you ended on a positive note that as much as things will change, things may also stay the same, so that there will be a new normal that will probably be just as good or even better than the old normal. And so I look forward to visiting Iceland again, hopefully soon when things get better. And again, thank you so much for doing this, and we appreciate it. Again, thanks to the audience. I would like to turn this back over to Vanessa, who will give any last minute information about how you may be able to listen to this podcast recording again. So thank you again, Fridrik, and nice to see you after so many months. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you to everyone for joining today's conversation. We really hope you found the discussion valuable, and we appreciated your thoughtful questions and participation. We will be sending out a recording to all attendees, so keep track of your email for that. And we look forward to your attendance at our future webinars and virtual events. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you. See you, Fridrik.
See you. Speak soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.